Imagine a moment in history so quietly transformative that no textbook ever mentions it. Yet its ripples shape the very way human societies perceive crisis, trust, and collective decision-making. Picture the year 536 CE, a time when the sun disappeared behind a veil of dust for nearly 18 months, plunging the world into cold, famine, and social upheaval. The historical record barely acknowledges it, yet this single event forced civilizations to adapt in ways that neuroscience and psychology can now help us understand. What if the hidden patterns of human behavior during such crises reveal more about our collective mind than any philosophical treatise ever could? This is not just history. It is an exploration of human resilience, perception, and the subtle mechanisms that govern societal survival. In this video, we will uncover the historical event schools never told you about, a paradoxical intersection of environment, cognition, and social adaptation that challenges our assumptions about human strength and fragility. The year 536 CE marks the beginning of what historians have later described as a global catastrophe. But the real story lies in how societies reacted to an event so overwhelming that it tested the very limits of collective perception. Modern psychology suggests that extreme stress triggers what we call a fight, flight, or freeze response, a survival mechanism embedded in the human brain over hundreds of thousands of years. But what happens when entire societies are frozen, not by predators, but by atmospheric anomalies and climatic disruption? When the sun dimmed and crops failed, the human brain was bombarded by conflicting signals. The environment suggested scarcity, yet social structures still demanded cohesion and cooperation. Historical evidence shows a striking pattern. Communities that survived the worst effects were those that adapted their internal social networks, like neural circuits in the brain, rerouting trust, cooperation, and leadership pathways to maintain function under stress. In other words, the societal energy grid reorganized itself, much like neurons do in the brain when faced with trauma, preserving critical connections and pruning weaker or less adaptive behaviors. The Byzantine Empire, for instance, faced extreme famine and plague during this period. Records indicate that Emperor Justinian's court struggled to maintain authority, yet the empire persisted. Psychologically, we might interpret this as a system-wide stress response. The central authority weakened, allowing peripheral networks, local leaders, merchants, and religious institutions to stabilize communities in a decentralized manner. This is analogous to the concept of neuroplasticity, where the brain rewires itself after injury, optimizing the remaining connections to preserve function. Meanwhile, in Northern Europe, crop failures induced mass migrations, social unrest, and localized famines. Yet these crises also accelerated innovation. Archaeological evidence suggests shifts in agricultural techniques, trade patterns, and even early forms of proto-democratic governance in certain tribal networks. From a psychological standpoint, these adaptations reflect a collective problem-solving mechanism. When traditional pathways fail, systems generate alternative solutions, much like a neural network generating new synaptic connections in response to repeated stress. The 536 CE event, though invisible in most classrooms, demonstrates a profound lesson about human perception. When environmental cues contradict lived experience, sunlight disappears, summers turn frigid, and famine spreads, the brain struggles to integrate sensory data with expectation. This creates a kind of societal cognitive dissonance where communities misinterpret signals, respond inconsistently, and yet, over time, recalibrate. It's a striking metaphor for how history itself functions. We rarely perceive the forces shaping our world in real time, yet, retrospectively, the patterns are undeniable. Consider the contemporary relevance of this lesson. Modern societies face climate crises, pandemics, and geopolitical instability, and yet, our collective social brain continues to operate under similar principles. Stress triggers the activation of core networks, prioritizing essential functions, communication, resource distribution, and cooperative defense. Peripheral systems, such as luxury consumption or elective conflict, are pruned temporarily to conserve energy and maintain survival. Neuroscientific research supports this interpretation, showing that stress hormones like cortisol enhance certain cognitive functions, heightened vigilance, rapid decision-making, but suppress others, such as long-term planning or creative ideation. In historical contexts, this meant societies were forced into hyperfunctional states where only adaptive behaviors survived, shaping cultural norms for decades or centuries afterward. The event also highlights an often overlooked phenomenon, the collective unconscious of societies. Carl Jung's concept, though formulated centuries later, resonates with patterns observable in 536 CE. Communities, unconsciously responding to environmental stress, generated myths, religious practices, and social rituals that served as psychological stabilizers. People sought meaning in chaos, creating narratives that reinforced cohesion and mitigated panic. These rituals, while culturally specific, were neuropsychological adaptations. Symbolic systems allowed for predictable patterns in an unpredictable world, stabilizing the social cortex in much the same way that repetitive neural firing strengthens certain synaptic pathways. What is especially fascinating is the paradox of apparent weakness leading to resilience. When food shortages forced communities to redistribute resources, those who might have been marginalized women, elders, and lower-class laborers often became central to survival strategies. Their networks, previously peripheral, suddenly provided critical nodes in the societal brain, demonstrating that adaptability often arises from decentralization rather than centralized control. This insight aligns with modern complexity theory, which posits that robust systems are rarely monolithic. They survive precisely because they allow redundancy, diversity, and distributed problem-solving. In examining the psychological impact of the event, we find that perception itself was reshaped. Contemporary records describe strange atmospheric phenomena, unusual diseases, and erratic crop failures. Humans are wired to detect patterns, but extreme novelty creates signal-to-noise challenges, too much unexpected input, and the brain struggles to separate meaningful data from chaos. Societies responded by institutionalizing certain forms of interpretation: astrology, divination, religious prophecy, creating frameworks that filtered sensory overload into actionable narratives. These frameworks were not mere superstition. They were adaptive cognitive scaffolds. If we translate this to modern neuroscience, we see the formation of schemas, mental structures that organize knowledge and guide behavior under uncertainty. Similarly, the 536 CE event forced a global recalibration of social schemas, altering trade networks, religious hierarchies, and political allegiances. Beyond the immediate century, we observe long-term evolutionary impacts on human behavior and cultural memory. Populations that survived these climatic anomalies developed social norms emphasizing cooperation, risk-sharing, and flexible leadership. Anthropologically, this aligns with theories suggesting that episodic crises accelerate cultural evolution, pruning maladaptive behaviors while reinforcing strategies that enhance survival probability.
Metaphorically, the event acts as a historical EEG reading, where spikes of stress, adaptation, and innovation are visible across time. Every famine, plague, or environmental shock leaves traces akin to neuroimprints, subtle shifts in behavior, belief, and structure that propagate through generations. The historical signal of 536 CE may be invisible in traditional education, but its echoes resonate in how societies manage scarcity, uncertainty, and collective stress today. Another striking example of hidden historical influence lies in the Anglo-Saxon migration patterns post-536 CE. As environmental pressures displaced populations, groups were forced to negotiate new social contracts, establishing hybrid networks of cooperation and conflict. Psychological theory would suggest that this is a natural manifestation of social cognition under constraint. Humans form alliances, hierarchies, and reputational systems to optimize survival under novel conditions. Archaeological and linguistic evidence indicates that these shifts catalyze profound cultural synthesis, ultimately laying foundations for early European nation-states. It is a reminder that history is invisible events, those often omitted from standard curricula, carry immense explanatory power for understanding the present. The lesson extends further into philosophy. How do societies interpret catastrophe, and what moral frameworks emerge? When faced with extreme environmental uncertainty, communities often prioritize pragmatic solutions over idealistic principles. ethical systems may shift toward utilitarianism or narratives of providence emerge to justify survival strategies. This is not merely a moral tale, but an insight into the adaptive nature of belief itself. Ideology, ritual, and social cohesion are cognitive tools shaped by evolutionary pressures and environmental contingencies. Returning to the metaphor of the brain as a system, we can see 536 CE as a diagnostic moment. The world's social cortex faced an unprecedented stimulus and responded by reorganizing, strengthening some pathways, while letting others weaken. The energy of human networks, traits, communication, and governance was rerouted to maintain homeostasis. In doing so, societies not only survived but evolved, creating more resilient frameworks for future challenges. Modern neuroscience confirms that such rewiring under stress is essential for long-term adaptability. Without it, both biological and social systems risk collapse. Perhaps the most fascinating insight is how perception of weakness masks underlying resilience. Where historians see famine, disease, and decline, the adaptive mind sees reorganization, recalibration, and potential. Communities that appeared fragile were, in fact, engaged in complex problem solving and resource redistribution that ultimately preserved the integrity of the system. This is a lesson with contemporary resonance. Moments of apparent vulnerability may, paradoxically, be when systems are at their most adaptable, their most capable of long-term survival. In closing, the hidden historical events like the 536 CE anomaly are not mere curiosities. They are mirrors reflecting the principles of human cognition, social psychology, and evolutionary adaptation. They show us that history is not just a linear narrative of kings and battles, but a complex interplay of perception, stress response, and systemic reorganization. Every crisis, famine, or environmental shock carries lessons encoded in the very structure of human society. The importance of flexibility, the power of decentralization, and the subtle mechanisms by which collective intelligence emerges under pressure. So the next time you feel overwhelmed by global crises or personal challenges, consider this: the very mechanisms that allowed humanity to survive the shadows of 536 CE. The rewiring of social networks, the redistribution of resources, the creative problem solving still present within us. We are collectively a living archive of adaptation, resilience, and latent potential, constantly recalibrating to signals from our environment. History, neuroscience, and psychology converge to reveal that what seems like vulnerability may actually be the signal of hidden strength, and what seems like chaos may be the prelude to evolutionary sophistication. As you reflect on this, I invite you to look beyond the headlines and the textbooks. Ask yourself, which hidden historical signals are shaping our world today? How might we, as individuals and as a society, harness the lessons of collective adaptation to navigate uncertainty? Share your thoughts in the comments, explore these ideas further, and if you found this journey through overlooked history enlightening, like the video, and subscribe to Past Lens for more explorations into the hidden currents that have shaped our world and continue to influence the collective human experience.